and welcome to a fresh new episode of Geopolitics with Swasti, where our consulting editor for strategic and international affairs, Swasti Rao, takes your questions, dear subscribers, on geopolitical developments around the world. Swasti, to begin with, this week has been all about the Israel Iran conflict. And
Hmm.
before we begin this episode, I would like to tell you that our next episode is going to be a special on the Israel Iran conflict. So, do send in your questions and we will focus singularly on the topic for the next episode. But for this episode, Swasti, I would also like to begin with it since a lot of our subscribers have this question.
Hmm.
And basically, the burning question on everyone's mind is what are the latest developments in Operation Rising Lion at this point?
I mean, I know why we had to actually work this modus operandi out because there were just so many questions on it, and we thought of doing a special episode. But just to give you like a brief sense of what the updates have been, the updates have been pretty staggering in many ways because
Right,
the operation was launched on the 13th of June, and it's been almost 5 days of continuous airstrikes. Israel very early on achieved a complete air superiority over Iranian skies, and the Iranian air defenses were almost not working at all. And to cut a long story short, because we are going to be dedicating an entire episode to that, to cut a long story short, right now it is at a very important tipping point. First, but very quickly, what are Israel's objectives? Israel seems to be having almost two, three objectives, clear objectives. One is that they want to stop Iranian regime from developing the nuclear bomb, which according to the IAEA report, which came towards the end of May, it said that they're only weeks away from it. Okay.
right,
Then the other thing is that it's not just the stopping, Iran from developing the nukes, but also about decapacitating and decimating their ballistic missile program because
right,
Iran has the largest inventory of ballistic missiles in the Middle Eastern region. Okay, so I think that's also a way of sort of decapacitating that military capability because remember, Iran doesn't have an air force, but Iran has a formidable, arsenal of ballistic missiles, etc. Which are many of those are indigenously developed and all that, and they also have hypersonic missiles. And the third is very clearly regime change,
right.
which has been reiterated again and again by different quarters. And the latest is that yesterday, when Donald Trump, who was in GC, who was in Canada for the G7, had to leave midway and come back to DC, and then eventually put out on Truth Social that he wants an unconditional surrender from the Iranian regime. Also now shows certain signs that US could be really planning to get militarily involved. I still find it a little far-fetched because US military involvement could mean a whole host of things, and America under Donald Trump has been extremely wary and reluctant to get militarily involved, but we will see because the situation is evolving very fast. And one of the things that actually has put so much focus on US involvement in the region is also this bomb called the bunker busting bomb, which is a GBU 57, which only the United States has in the world. And why this has now become such a rallying point when it comes to geopolitical analysis on the Israel Iran situation is because, the nuclear enrichment facilities within Iran are spread across the country. So, in the first set of strikes, Israel has targeted facilities in Natanz and facilities, Isfahan, etc. But there is another very important facility which is in Fordo, and the thing with Fordo is that it is
Right,
really shrouded under, about 200 feet under the ground, below the ground level. And for reaching those kind of facilities, you cannot do it only by missile strikes or airstrikes. You have to have a particular specialized weapon, and that is where the bunker busting bomb comes, which is a 30,000 pound heavy bomb, and which is dropped from a US B-2 bomber. So only the US has the ability and the launch machine to actually launch something like that, and it kind of goes inside the ground for about 200 feet, and then it sort of explodes. So for it operating anything like that, you would need to have US airmen, doing it, and that remains a question mark whether or not US is going to get involved to
deploy
that
all of
extent or
that.
not. But then there are also other signs of enhanced US involvement because there are about 30 American air refueling tankers that are already there in the region. Now, that could be done for the purpose of refueling Israeli jets or, for example, enabling joint strikes. But all this is just mere speculation. It's just that because of Donald Trump's very unequivocal A, support to Israel, and B, this call for unconditional surrender has actually then sparked all these speculations about to what degree is the US going to get involved. And there is some technical reason, because unless, if Israel is serious about taking out further enrichment facilities, it has to have something like the US weapon, and especially the bunker busting bomb. So this is the updates so far, and of course we are going to be coming back to it in terms of casualties.
Right.
Of course, Iran has had hundreds of casualties, but Israel also has had casualties. In fact, you know, we've been seeing there's been a lot of question mark on how exactly well is the Iron Dome functioning. Of course, it's functioning well, but this is a kind of an escalation that we have not seen in many many decades. So this is pretty much a turning point for where the Middle Eastern situation is going, and we will talk a lot more about it in the next
In the
episode.
next episode. Do remember to send in your questions so that we can discuss it in details. But Swasti, following up on that, our subscriber Ravi Rules has a very interesting question, which he calls a desi urge to do a Sharma ji ka beta comparison. But you know, a lot of people have been comparing the India-Israel situation,
Hmm.
and the Indian and Israeli strategic posture and tactics. And Ravi Rule's question on that is that, considering the new normal that India has set,
Hmm.
do you think the next time India will truly give full operational freedom and engage Pakistani military directly before the terrorists? And then, do you think that we can then truly take out Hafiz Saeed, Maulana Azhar type high value targets
Hmm.
instead of killing random foot soldiers?
Oh, no, well, it's an interesting question, and I know where this is coming from, because part of the reason why the Indian population also, I mean, this entire counterterrorism narrative sort of resonates so well. Israeli experience also resonates so well within the Indian populace, is also because we undergo a similar experience when it comes to being victim of terrorism. That's one part. So, in terms of the experience, I do see there's an experiential kind of a similarity, but that's where it probably ends somewhere, because when it comes to capabilities, I think it is very useful for us to remember and remind ourselves that we are not Mossads and we are not Israel. We are not a hard security state like Israel. So we obviously cannot really take the kind of options that Israel has taken. You compare it on any count, you know. Do we have the kind of ironclad support from the United States? No, we don't. Do we have a population where every single Indian citizen has to go or has to undergo compulsory conscription? No. I mean, you know, so it's like the sheer experience of how the two nation states have developed, and in what context have the two nation states developed. I mean, that is so radically different that no matter how much we sort of appreciate what Israel does when it comes to taking these decisions, I think it is a far cry from what we are able to do. And in the manner in which the two operations also unfolded is very very clear to tell you what the differences are. So, I mean, to just cut a long story short, because it can just go on for a very long time if I go on into the details of how each operation unfolded. But I think the one worthwhile thing for us to remember is that whatever we consider the new normal, please remember that even till date, neither the Prime Minister, nor the External Affairs Minister, nor the Defense Minister has actually spoken to the Indian people yet, you know, about what has happened, what were the objectives, what was the conditions of termination, if it is ongoing, what does it mean, what does a new normal mean, will India have the bandwidth to actually launch a kind of a war? Because if every act of terror is going to be an act of war, will it really mean to say that, you know, if there is one contact happening at the LOC, will it also trigger a war? And when you say a war, do you mean a kind of a mobilization that you would see in war? I think these are questions which are not yet answered. I think what really comes from the new normal and all this is basically posturing that India has called out Pakistan's nuclear bluff. And I think whatever comes later will have to be very carefully sort of, we will have to look at it step by step. So Sharma ji ka beta analogy is that कि ठीक है, we can appreciate, but हमारे geopolitical realities are very different. The
Different,
constraints are different,
absolutely.
and for understanding what we can do and how far we can go, it is also very useful to understand what we are not and what our limitations is, and have a
Right.
sincere discussion around it. You know, this is not just about अब वो बेहतर है और हम नहीं हैं, या हम बेहतर हैं वो नहीं है. This is not about it. It is about identifying the contextual similarities and dissimilarities. So any principle of doing a comparative study is to understand the similarities as well as the dissimilarities, and
Right.
in this case there are many dissimilarities as well at operational level.
Swasti, since we are already discussing Operation Sindoor, Ravi Rules has yet another question on a different domain this time, and it's the maritime domain. And he asks that what is India exactly doing in the maritime capabilities
Hmm.
with threats all around, and the fact that India does maintain a predominantly continental focus on its defense strategy. So,
Okay.
what is its maritime capabilities? What is its strategy, and what is it looking ahead to?
No, it's an interesting question. I think a lot of people have this conception that India seems to be preoccupied with the continental domain for very obvious reasons, because we have to disturb borders on either side of the continental expanse. So it
Right.
only makes sense. I think a lot of people get, and then of course, since we are also getting all the threats from that side. Despite that, let me also tell you that in the last 1 decade at least, okay, there has been a humongous stride in India's maritime vision. And once you have a vision, then you will start building capabilities, because you have to have a vision for which you will have to then build capabilities. Now, when it comes to Indian Navy, and I will tell you, I will break it down for you so that you get an understanding of how exactly it went. So it will, first of all, it'll sort of bust the myth that India is way too preoccupied with the continental domain. It has been the case earlier, but now it's been changing because all the futuristic plurilaterals or engagements or joint exercises, everything is happening with the rise of the construct of Indo-Pacific. And now we are looking at another maritime construct, which is the Indo-Mediterranean, and we are
Right.
looking at actually connecting Indo-Pacific with Indo-Mediterranean. So you can totally see that when it comes to bolstering India's capability and rise as a global power, and all the convergence that the different partners across the world, especially the Western partners, have with us, you will see that it's the maritime domain which is much more relevant to how we will take things forward. Now, with that, let me just tell you a little bit about the Indian Navy here, because out of the three forces, the Indian Army, the Indian Air Force, and the Indian Navy, generally it is the Indian Navy that gets the smallest share of the budget. But in my reading, it is also the Indian Navy that is most professional with using it most optimally. So, like Army, Air Force, and Navy all have shortfalls. We keep talking about Air Force and why the Air Chief is so upset with the HAL, etc. But at the same time, let me just tell you that in the current year 2025-26, the total budget allocation to the Indian Navy has been highest ever, and which is you know to the tune of 97,000 crore. But that 97,000 crore rupees is basically the entire budget. Out of that, if you look at only the capital procurement, which means naya saman kitne paise se kharidna, that is to the tune of 65 or 67,000 crore. So you do see that there is and the rest of the money goes in salaries and all of that, and pensions and all that. So that is something that you need to understand, that this particular rise that you see this year in the Indian Navy's budget has been quite phenomenal. If you compare it to last year's and the last few years, you can see there's been steady increase. In fact, from the last year, there's been a 19.76% increase, and this has happened. This itself shows how the Indian Navy is more serious about building more capabilities, etc., and also sort of navigating the capital procurement thing. That's one part. Secondly, for the last 2 years, let me also tell you, since we are discussing budgets, since last 2 years, there's another thing, Devdatta, which has happened, which actually should be mentioned and discussed more. As you know, we keep talking about how the defense procurement processes are so slow in India.
Right.
In the last 2 years, that what the Ministry of Finance and the MOD have done is that instead of dividing these procurement between the three forces, between Army and Air Force and the
Navy.
Navy, what they've done is that when it comes to capital procurement, they are doing it under a central body. And the purpose of keeping it or bringing it under the central body is to basically try and cut down the time that usually is spent. For example, there are helicopters, or there are aircraft, or certain things that the Navy also wants, the Air Force also wants, the Army also wants,
Right.
especially let's talk about the attack helicopters or something like that. So in that regard, what happens is that when you are purchasing it under a central body, the price negotiation, the cost negotiation committees function better. So basically, the purpose is to make it more efficient, and this is pretty much in tune with how we want to also become more self-reliant. How we want to really improve our very long-standing, long-drawn defense acquisition processes, the procurement. I mean, we've been getting criticism left, right, and center on just how slow our files move.
Right.
So this is also one attempt that we are doing, and we will see that overall we will see there may be some problems also, because the inter forces, the tri services have to also then talk and discuss more, and there are also criticisms that the army doesn't feel that the air force and the navy are on board, etc. So all these things notwithstanding, I think this is a positive step. So this is just to tell you what we are doing in terms of defense allocations, like the budget allocations, and how the budgets are supposed to be used. And
Right.
this has been a change that only came in last 2 years, so I thought I'll just share that with you. Now, like I said, that the second part of it is that how has India been building its maritime capabilities. So you just need to know that now whatever you see happening now also has a foundation. So if you can roughly divide the development in India's maritime vision in three phases. So the first phase would be, in my opinion, from 2004 to 2007, where India was focusing more on how to use the seas. Okay,
Right.
and then basically how to have more coastal presence, how to use the seas, etc. So this was something that happened in 2004 and 2007, and I think the first ever strategy, which was very rudimentary, but it came around that time. Then between 2007 and 2015, we see an emergence of a stronger stance, and where it was about also how do you ensure that your seas are secure, because remember that between 2007 and 2015, Xi Jinping had already come in 2012, and because of his very wolf warrior diplomacy in South China Sea, it actually necessitated for India to also have a fresh outlook towards how it's looking at maritime space, etc. And then in 2009, we had an upgrade to our maritime strategy. And then, how can we build more presence in, especially the IOR region, became more and more central. But obviously, there was a sea change in 2015 when the Sagar Doctrine came, which was security and growth for all in the region. And with that, the focus, which was earlier on using the seas, shifted to securing the seas. And that semantic shift itself will tell you how India matured its maritime outlook, because it was about freedom of navigation operations, it was about upholding a rules based order, because all of this came in the context of China destabilizing the maritime, especially the choke points, etc., and how India started to play a more important role. And that was the time in 2015 when this first Saga doctrine came. Then later in 2018, 2019, when the IPOI, when the Indo-Pacific vision came from India, you saw how, for instance, India started to work towards becoming a net security provider, net security partner, etc. And Indian Navy, of course, has a very, very central role there. Now, very quickly, just a couple of more things in terms of how we are building our fleet, etc. There is no doubt about the fact that we want to reach the baseline of about 200 warships. Currently, we are at about 130 warships only. But at the same time, and even now, we are dependent on foreign partners for engines, for example. By the way,
Right.
I don't know if you remember, I keep repeating it again and again that when it comes to the frontline warships that we have about 130, all those engines are coming from Ukraine. Those are Ukrainian gas turbine engines. In fact, even our latest frigates that we got from Russia, Tamal and Tushil, etc., where two of them were supposed to be built in India, two of them were supposed to come from Russia,
Russia.
and Rajnath ji went to Russia to get them. I think it was last year or early this year. Even those frigates have Ukrainian gas turbine engines. So the dependence continues, but when it comes to indigenous construction, the designing, etc., I think India has come a long way, and there are major players in the Indian ecosystem like L&T, etc., who are doing very, very good work. Similarly, we've been really working very hard to build our submarine fleet, and this must be highlighted because if you remember, some months ago, it was I think around February or sometime earlier this year, when there was a lot of criticism of why the Indian Navy gave up on its plan of acquiring the third aircraft carrier. And the idea was that if you want to power project in the Indian Ocean region, you have to have the classic, aircraft carrier,
Right.
because aircraft carrier is something that really makes you feel as if you've arrived. Okay, and the biggest navies, the blue water navies, okay, whether it's the United States or France or China, they have aircraft carriers. So carrier is like a power projection. But the catch out there is that I just told you about how Navy gets the smallest share of defense budget, and also when you further reduce it to capital procurement, it's even lesser. So even our indigenous aircraft carrier, we already have two, and now the point was to now go for a third one. Even our indigenously made aircraft carriers are more expensive than the entire budget which is allocated for capital procurement for the Navy. And because of that, there was a very sound decision taken by the establishment saying that no, let's put it on hold, we will do it later, we understand we need to power project, so we'll do it later. For now we are going to be investing more on drones, underwater drones, for example, that have been a game changer in Ukraine war. Also, we have to keep in mind how China's underwater drone capabilities are growing, because China is all the time unveiling its disruptive capabilities when it comes to destroying the undersea cables and critical infrastructure. So I think those kind of things are more important. So having submarines is more important, having drones are more important, having AI enabled drones. So those kind of things are being focused upon right now much more. Not to say that the aircraft carrier has been shelved, but this is not the right time for us to go into these massive procurements at the cost of it when we have lesser money. So in many ways, I think the Indian Navy, if you go into the literature, you will see that they are trying very hard to integrate the fourth industrial revolution, which is about all technology, drones and automation and naval AI, because that's where the future is going, and that's what the current wars are showing us. And this can just go on, but I'll just give you a couple of more ideas, a couple of more points to just clarify it to you that Indian Navy is doing a lot to actually really harness the potential of our maritime domain. So, for example, our surveillance infrastructure has grown a lot. You may have heard of this wonderful initiative called the IFCIOR, which is Information Fusion Center for the Indian Ocean region, which is headquartered in Gurgaon. Okay, and there you will see that India is partnering with more than 40 countries. Now critics will say that just having an information fusion center will not help, because it's still relegated only to white shipping, etc. It's not really looking at exchange of intelligence, and exchange of intelligence is also important if you really want to understand where the disturbances are. But despite that, come to think of this, come to look at it as a benchmark of how far we've come. And this is just the beginning. So when it comes to surveillance, etc., you do see that the Indian Navy is actually investing a lot. We have a lot of partner countries. In fact, a lot of partner countries give the IFC IOR as a case study of how far India has come in the Indo-Pacific domain. Similarly, if you look at the sheer number of our exercises and how we are building on interoperability through these exercises, right? Initially, we were only doing with the regional countries. Then we started doing with Quad, the Malabar exercises. We started doing with France, and now we are doing many of these exercises that we are doing are with multiple partners. So all of that actually is enhancing our naval capabilities, our interoperability, etc. So we are together there. Similarly, if you see the number of deployments or port visits, it's significantly grown. So now, but just to sort of put it into perspective, the fact that we are making progress is okay, but when you start assessing this progress that we have made in comparison to how far China has gone, you will certainly see that we need to do more. And that is why we cannot do it alone. In this theater, which is as vast as the Indo Pacific domain, we will have to look out for partners. And that is why nimble plurilaterals actually work so well in the Indo Pacific region. And here, I mean, Quad. In fact, lately there's one very, I would say, ambitious project that I have been working on, which is that how do you develop a more coordinated response around hybrid threats in the region? Because currently everybody is just obsessed with what happens if there's a war in the Taiwan Straits and how will each country behave then. But whether or not there is a war in the Taiwan Straits actually remains etched in the future. But why the Indo-Pacific domain is vulnerable today is because of hybrid threats, and we must have a more coordinated and cogent response towards that. So I'm developing, lots of models on how we can do something more with like-minded players. Of course, nobody can do it alone. But in terms of how far India is serious about its maritime domain, India is extremely serious about it. And for the paucity of time, I couldn't really tell you everything, but I'm sure you had an idea.
And Swasti, moving on, our subscriber Karthik Parashar wants to know what geopolitical power does Oman hold that the US Iran deal, which eventually didn't happen, was happening there?
Yeah, the Iranians and the Americans were supposed to meet in Oman, and that never happened because Israel went solo. Now, it's an interesting question because it's not just that Oman was picked up randomly. Oman is a very, very stable nation. It is a very, I would say, a nation that is doing very well. And if, in fact, if you see it on the map, you will see what kind of a geopolitically contested space it has. So you will then see that compared to many of its neighbors, of course, Oman has been extremely stable. And there's another reason why Oman is usually the preferred mediator and the preferred destination for having these talks. Because in 1978, they had a Dhofar rebellion. And of course, that's a war, and there's no reason for me to go into the details of the war, but I'll just tell you the important outcomes. So, in terms of the outcomes, what happened was that Oman landed up having a very, I would say, stable relationship with a whole host of foreign powers. So with the UK, they were able to establish good relations. With Iran, they were able to establish good relations. Also in the Gulf states, they were able to have good relations. Okay, and they became very progress oriented. So there was a particular time before 1978, Oman wasn't like that, but after 1970, they've been consistently working on trying to have stabilizing relationship with all the partners in the region, and also the bigger partners, like for example back then it was the UK. Similarly, what also makes Oman interesting is because Oman is also the government out there is not really into this Shia Sunni split. If you know that
Right.
there is a, I don't know if you know, Karthik, but there is a huge problem with respect to the Muslim world unity in the Middle East. Okay, so Middle East does not really believe in one Muslim voice. Iran out there is all Shia,
Shia,
and the Saudi Arabia and UAE and all these guys are complete and are
Sunni.
Sunni, and there is a Shia Sunni divide and the Shia Sunni rivalry and wars happening all the time. Oman, on the contrary, has an Ibadi Muslim government, which does not really believe in the Shia Sunni split as much. I don't know the details, I'm not an expert on Oman, but these are the reasons that make Oman a very attractive place for mediation, because they are not really party to all these conflicts. Similarly, when it comes to hosting Iran, for example, if you look at the map again, you can see that it's also the strategic location of Oman where it is sharing, the Strait of Hormuz's critical maritime routes with Iran.
Right.
And all of this sort of necessitates the fact that Oman is a stable place for any of these discussions to happen.
Take place.
Similarly, it is not for the first time that Oman was chosen. Even earlier, over the successive years, USA and Iran have chosen to speak at Oman, because Oman, for the reasons that I just told you about. And also, it is not just about Oman, but also if you look at the tensions in Yemen, Oman has also offered itself to be this one place where
Right.
the Americans can speak about that as well. So, this is just to give you a brief understanding of why Oman was chosen as a potential place for these mediation and for the talks to happen. By the way, many countries in the Gulf actually posit themselves as the hosts. Okay, and of course Dubai is one of them, and Saudi Arabia, as you know, the most of the Russia-Ukraine negotiations are happening either in Dubai, the prisoners of war exchanges, or the American and the Russians have been speaking at Jeddah. So all of that has been happening. When it comes to negotiations with Iran, Oman has a special reason, and I just told you 4 or 5 reasons why it makes sense. So even though the current talks have failed because Israel has chosen to go solo, but whenever there is a need to have discussions again,
It
perhaps Oman
will.
would be chosen again.
And Swasi, since we are talking about US, our
Mhm.
subscriber Aditya18893 has this question that amid all of this conflict and what is happening, how do you think that organizations like G7 will survive also amid a new Trump administration?
Now it can have a very long answer. How can organizations like G7 survive because of Trump? Um, Yes, currently, the times that we are in, the kind of divide that we see within the Western bloc is something which has been rather unprecedented, because Donald Trump has chosen to go after its allies and partners first, right? So that is the reason Donald Trump is the chief disruptor here. But having said that, I think from India's perspective, it opens opportunities for us to then engage even with a renewed vigor. And we do see that happening, especially if you look at the case of Europe, because
Right.
both India and Europe find in each other a more stable partner than this constantly shifting goalposts that Trump sort of champions. So that's one part. But in terms of survival, see, G7 is a grouping of world's most advanced economies. Okay, in that regard, of course, it is going to survive, because the world's most advanced economies are not just advanced in their respective or in their individual capacities. They are advanced because technologically speaking, they collaborate, intelligence they share, right? They are also sharing the trade. But I do share your assessment that in the current divide that we see in the larger West, this concern that you have is genuine. How far the G7 is going to go, etc. But from our perspective, I think G7 remains very important, because most, if you look at the individual members also, I think the most of our, whether it's bilateral trade or our ambitious FTAs or our diaspora, remittances, most of these are coming from technological innovation, defense industry cooperation. All of that is actually coming from the individual G7 members. And when it comes to, since Prime Minister is going there, this is also a tradition. India has been, this is the sixth time that Prime Minister
Yeah.
is going there for the outreach session. This is not for the core G7, but the outreach session where many of these international organizations are also invited. So I suggest you also watch my explainer on the same, where I have gone into the details of why Prime Minister first went to Cyprus, and then he went to Canada, and now he'll be going to Croatia, etc. But the short answer is that it is too early to somewhere say that the G7 has lost its relevance. No, the G7 has its relevance. The idea to understand is that right now there is no such grouping in the world that can operate in isolation. And that is the larger point that many of these analyses miss, because the point is that of building complementarity. The point is not to just keep harping on the fact that one grouping is not enough and the other grouping is not enough. We No grouping by itself is enough, because if they are the economies of skill, we are the economies of scale.
Swasti, since we already talked about Modi going to Croatia, and following up on that, our users Anubhav Saxena has this question that can you please explain how India is or can build relationships with Balkan countries like Croatia, Serbia, Slovakia, etc. Smart
So
question.
it's actually one of my most favorite topics, frankly, Devdatta, because I've taught this, Balkanization of the former Yugoslavia for 3 years as a very important conflict case study of international conflict. So it's a very favorite topic of mine. So I will try to not let the professor in me take over, and I will try to keep it brief. But nonetheless, I think the first thing you need to understand, and a lot of viewers also don't know, is that Balkans, Baltics, Caucasus में difference क्या है? Balkans mountains है, Baltic Sea है, Caucasus में mountain है. So Balkans is a region. This is a mountainous region, in Europe, where there are Balkan mountains, and it has regions of former Yugoslavia, and also many other countries like Bulgaria, Romania, Albania. In fact, some people also go to the extent of putting Greece in the Balkan region. So, as you know, I mean, this is just to give you an understanding of where the Balkans are. Now, very quickly, when you say former Yugoslavia, I mean, I'm not getting into the history, but I'm just saying that former Yugoslavia was the socialist country which was held together by Marshal Tito. And when it started breaking down from the end of the 80s and all the decade, the entire decade of the 90s, and it was a very, very bloody war, you saw many independent countries emerging. So, for example, Croatia, Slovenia, Macedonia, Serbia. Also, Serbia has a problem with Kosovo. I'm sure you've heard Kosovo earlier. Bosnia Herzegovina. All these countries emerged from former Yugoslavia, and not everybody's status right now is completely final. So, for example, Bosnia Herzegovina and Serbia, they have disputes. Serbia and Kosovo have disputes, but the rest, Slovenia, Croatia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia, they are independent and they are fine. So this is one part, but like I said, there are also countries like Bulgaria, Albania, Romania, and Greece that are sometimes counted within the Balkans. Now, the interesting bit for you to understand here is that many of these countries are part of both the EU and NATO. Okay, and when you get into out of all the countries that I just listed, which are the countries that are part of both the EU and NATO, I can give you a list, which are Bulgaria, Croatia, Greece, Romania, and Slovenia. These countries are members of both the EU and the NATO. But then there are also countries which are part of NATO but not a part of the EU.
EU.
And those countries are Albania, Montenegro, and North Macedonia, which are only NATO members. They are not yet part of the EU. And then there are countries that are part of neither, like Bosnia Herzegovina, सर्बिया एंड जहां तक सर्बिया की बात है सर्बिया में बहुत होता रहता है बिकॉज वूचेक इज प्लेइंग ऑल साइड्स and sometimes that is the only country which is really supported by Russia. I didn't have the time to get into the details of it, so I would have told you what role did Russia play there. But Serbia has been always supported by Russia, and now because Russia is so preoccupied with the war in Ukraine, which has been a strategic blunder by Putin, because of that war, they lost their export base, they lost their influence in the Balkans, they lost their influence in the Caucasus. Why do you think India is sending all the weapons to Armenia? Why do you think France is sending all the weapons to Armenia? Because Russia, which has been the biggest weapon supplier, is not able to do so. So, long and short is that Serbia has a very unique position out there. They want to play Russia. They also want to play the EU. Sometimes there is a rhetoric of whether they want to get into the EU, whether they not want to get into the EU. So that all keeps going. Now, very quickly, what is also happening is that only this year, because your question is what is India now doing for increasing its participation in the Balkans? And it is interesting. Why do you think Prime Minister went to Croatia? Prime Minister went to Croatia because in May this year, which is last month, so in May this year, there was the first EU India Trade Council's conference on Balkans. So the first Balkan conference between EU and India happened in May 2025. And this was a larger conference that also drew partners from the Gulf, partners from, not just those regional Balkan players, but also the E4. And when I say the E4, I mean UK, France, Germany, and Italy, which are the biggest four economies of and biggest powers of Europe. And now many say that we have to make it E5 because of the rise of Poland, which is you obviously cannot miss. So that said, I think what is India doing now is that India, if you carefully see, has been developing more strategic gateways into Europe, because India, for the longest time, only engaged with the bigger powers. Okay, and now India realizes that there is so much unrealized potential when it comes to Balkans, when it comes to Caucasus, when it comes to the Mediterranean arc of Europe. So you can totally see how India is developing more connectivity projects. Why do you think Prime Minister went to Marseille and called it Mumbai Marseille connectivity? IMEC. When you think about IMEC, now there is so much discussion on the fact that IMEC is not some like a straight line. IMEC is a concept. The idea as to how do you connect India and Europe through Middle East by different strategic gateways. So the port of Trieste in Italy becomes important. The port of Thessaloniki in Greece becomes important, because these ports are directly connected to the Central and East European markets and the Balkans, etc. So, what then happens is that right now India understands that as these smaller countries of Europe that are not very affluent, as their Western neighbors, are looking for China plus one diversification, and China's over promise and under delivery is not really faring well. It is a godsend opportunity for India to cement its outreach in those regions. They are looking at infrastructure development. India's engagement is not seen as destabilizing. India's engagement is welcomed by the smaller parties in Europe as well as the bigger players of Europe. So I just gave you the example of the Balkan conference, which happened in 2025 May. Now, this was not just happening between these small Balkan countries and India. Like I said, that it was supported by the Gulf countries. It was supported by the big powers of Europe. It was supported by European Union. What does it tell you? That everybody has a stake when it comes to having more of India in Europe through these strategic gateways, because ultimately our bilateral trade is going to grow. The total trade is already reaching $200 billion of, in goods and services, and there's immense potential once the FTA is signed.
Right.
So not only look at Antwerp, Rotterdam, and Hamburg, the traditional routes through which our cargo entered Europe, but all develop simultaneously many more. And then, because India is also looking strategically at these countries, so you will see, for example, that India is doing a lot when it comes to countries like Albania, countries like Bosnia Herzegovina. You will see the consultations have risen. So India is serious about that. And then, if you then see it in complementarity with what India is doing in nearby Caucasus, okay, or the Baltics. Our engagement with Baltics have also deepened. So then you get a full picture of how India is looking at developing more strategic gateways into Europe, and something which is welcomed by everybody in the region.